The hostess's words hung in the air like a physical barrier. "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you here." Her voice was firm but uncomfortable as she stood between Jonathan Roumie and the bustling restaurant behind her. Other diners paused mid-conversation, silverware clinking to stillness as heads turned toward the entrance. The restaurant owner, a tall woman with sharp features, stepped forward from behind the counter, arms crossed defensively across her chest as she nodded in agreement with her employee. Jonathan Roumie, known worldwide for portraying Jesus in The Chosen, stood motionless for a moment, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding. The small silver cross pendant visible at his neck seemed to catch the light, drawing the owner's narrowed gaze. He could have argued, could have made a scene, could have pulled out his phone to share this moment of discrimination with millions of followers who would rally to his defense. Instead, he took a deep breath, and what he did next would change not just one restaurant, but an entire community. Have you ever wondered how a simple act of kindness in the face of rejection could transform lives? How responding with grace instead of outrage might bridge the deepest divides? Earlier that day, Jonathan Roumie pulled his car into the parking lot of the Philosophy Table, a trendy new restaurant in downtown Portland. He'd spent the morning doing podcast interviews about the latest season of The Chosen, and his growling stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since the quick banana and coffee he'd managed before his 6 a.m. call time. The restaurant had excellent reviews online, and he looked forward to a quiet meal before his evening speaking engagement at a local church. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement as Jonathan walked toward the restaurant's entrance. He adjusted his jacket and ran a hand through his dark hair, smiling at a couple who recognized him as they exited. The Philosophy Table had an industrial chic aesthetic, with exposed brick walls visible through large windows, and a sign featuring a famous quote from Nietzsche about God being dead. Jonathan hadn't noticed that detail online, but it didn't bother him. He'd always enjoyed philosophical conversations with people of different beliefs. Inside, the restaurant hummed with conversation and activity. Edison bulbs hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the wooden tables. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on philosophy, science, and humanism. A chalkboard near the entrance listed daily specials alongside quotes from famous atheist thinkers. The hostess, a young woman with purple-tipped hair and a nose ring, greeted him with a professional smile. "Table for one, please," Jonathan said, returning her smile warmly. He was used to being recognized, but sometimes, especially in progressive cities like Portland, he could blend in as just another bearded guy in his 40s. Today seemed to be one of those days, and he was grateful for the anonymity that would allow him to enjoy a peaceful meal. The hostess reached for a menu, but paused as she glanced down at the small silver cross pendant visible at Jonathan's open collar. Her eyes moved to his face, studying it more carefully. Recognition dawned in her expression, followed quickly by something else, discomfort. "You're Jonathan Roumie, right? From The Chosen?" she asked, her voice lowering slightly. "Yes, that's me," Jonathan admitted with a good-natured shrug. He was used to this moment of recognition, the slight shift in how people interacted with him once they realized who he was. Usually it led to kind words about the show or requests for photos or prayers. Occasionally, there was awkwardness from those unfamiliar or uncomfortable with faith content. But what happened next caught him completely off guard. The hostess's smile disappeared. She glanced over her shoulder toward a woman behind the counter who appeared to be the manager or owner. The woman had been watching the exchange and now approached with a determined stride. "Is there a problem, Zoe?" she asked the hostess, though her eyes were fixed on Jonathan with an unmistakable look of disapproval. "This is Jonathan Roumie," the hostess explained quietly. "The actor from that Christian show." She said the word Christian as if it might be offensive to say too loudly in this space. The owner's posture stiffened noticeably, her lips pressing into a thin line as she assessed Jonathan from head to toe. "I see," the owner said, her voice cool and clipped. She was around 50, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp, intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. "Mr. Roumie, I'm Diane Mercer, the owner of the Philosophy Table. I should inform you that this establishment was founded as a safe space for the atheist and humanist community. Your presence here," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "might make our regular patrons uncomfortable." Jonathan blinked, taking a moment to process what he was hearing. Was she actually refusing to serve him because of his faith? Because of the character he portrayed? He looked around the restaurant, noticing for the first time the subtle themes he'd missed before. The books were exclusively by atheist authors. The quotes were all from secular humanist thinkers, and even the art on the walls seemed to celebrate a world without divine presence. "I'm just looking for a meal before my event this evening," Jonathan explained calmly, keeping his voice friendly and conversational. "I respect that you've created a space with a specific philosophy, but I'd be happy to just eat quietly without discussing faith or my work." He offered a gentle smile, hoping to diffuse the tension that was building between them. Diane's expression didn't soften. "The issue isn't whether you discuss your faith, Mr. Roumie. Your very presence, as someone who portrays Jesus and advocates for Christianity, runs counter to the environment we've carefully cultivated here. The philosophy table was created specifically as a refuge from religious influences." Her words were measured but firm, leaving no room for negotiation. By now, several nearby tables had gone quiet, diners watching the exchange with curiosity or discomfort. A few were taking out their phones, and Jonathan knew this confrontation could go viral within minutes if he responded poorly. The hostess looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to another as she awaited resolution. "So you're refusing to serve me because I'm a Christian? Because of my role in The Chosen?" Jonathan asked, not confrontationally but seeking clarity. He kept his voice low and calm, though inside he felt a complicated mix of emotions: surprise, disappointment, and concern about the hypocrisy of refusing service based on religious beliefs. "I'm refusing to serve you because your presence contradicts the mission of this establishment," Diane replied, crossing her arms. "This restaurant was created as a donation-supported gathering place for the atheist community, a community that has often felt marginalized by the dominant Christian culture. Your presence here would be like me showing up at your church and demanding to be heard." Jonathan nodded slowly, processing her words. He thought about responding that a church would actually welcome her, regardless of her beliefs, but he sensed that such a comment might only escalate the situation. He could feel the eyes of other patrons on him. A tense silence had fallen over the nearest tables. That's when the hostess spoke the words that would hang in the air like a physical barrier. "I'm sorry, but we can't serve you here," she said, her voice firm but uncomfortable. Other diners paused mid-conversation, silverware clinking to stillness as heads turned toward the entrance. Diane stood tall, arms still crossed defensively across her chest, as she nodded in agreement with her employee. Jonathan felt a familiar sense of calm wash over him, the same feeling he often experienced before filming deeply emotional scenes for The Chosen. He thought about Jesus being rejected in his hometown, about the lessons of turning the other cheek, about responding to hostility with love. This wasn't just an uncomfortable moment, it was an opportunity to live what he believed. He could have pulled out his phone and live-streamed the interaction to his followers. He could have argued about discrimination or hypocrisy. He could have made a scene that would surely trend on social media within hours. Instead, Jonathan smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes, and nodded in acceptance. "I understand," he said simply. "Thank you for being honest about your feelings." He turned to leave, then paused and turned back. "If you change your mind, I'll be at the coffee shop across the street for a while. I respect the space you've created here, even if we see the world differently." With that, he walked out the door, leaving behind a restaurant full of people who had just witnessed something unexpected. What Jonathan couldn't see as he left was the effect his response had on those watching. No righteous indignation, no threats of lawsuits or boycotts, no angry denouncements, just calm acceptance and respect. Several patrons exchanged uncomfortable glances. A man at the bar whispered to his companion, "That didn't feel right." The young woman who'd been recording the interaction on her phone slowly lowered her device, looking thoughtful. Across the street at Cloudbreak Coffee, Jonathan found a small table by the window. He ordered a sandwich and coffee, pulled out his phone, and texted his assistant to let her know where he was. He had a clear view of the philosophy table from his seat, and he said a quiet prayer for Diane and her restaurant, asking for blessing rather than judgment. Inside the philosophy table, conversations had resumed, but there was an uneasy energy in the air. Alex Martinez, a server who had witnessed the entire exchange, carried plates to a table while wrestling with conflicting thoughts. He was an atheist himself and had been excited to work at a restaurant that aligned with his worldview. But what he'd just seen didn't sit right with him. Alex had grown up in a strict religious household where questions about faith were discouraged. His rejection of religion had come after years of feeling judged and constrained. Yet watching Jonathan Roumie's calm, kind response to being turned away made him uncomfortable. Wasn't this the same kind of exclusion he had resented growing up? He delivered food to table 7, his mind still replaying the scene at the entrance. Lily Chen sat at a corner table, picking at her salad while scrolling through her phone. She was a regular at the philosophy table, having found community there after leaving her Christian upbringing behind. She'd been excited about the restaurant's mission of creating a space free from religious pressure. But watching a man be refused service simply because of his beliefs made her stomach knot with discomfort. Diane returned to her office behind the kitchen, closing the door harder than necessary. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat at her desk. She had opened the philosophy table after years of feeling marginalized for her atheism, after losing friends when she came out as a non-believer, after family gatherings where grace was said despite her discomfort. She'd created this space as a sanctuary, so why did she feel so unsettled about turning Jonathan Roumie away? At Cloudbreak Coffee, Jonathan ate his sandwich slowly, savoring each bite. He looked across the street occasionally, wondering about the people inside the philosophy table. He believed deeply in the dignity of every person, regardless of their beliefs. Jesus had dined with everyone: tax collectors, sinners, those rejected by religious society. The irony wasn't lost on him that in this situation, he was the one deemed unworthy of a place at the table. His phone buzzed with a text from Dallas Jenkins, creator of The Chosen. Dallas was checking in about tomorrow's filming schedule. Jonathan responded with details about his evening speaking engagement, but didn't mention what had happened at the restaurant. He wasn't interested in creating controversy or playing the victim. This was between him and God, a small opportunity to practice what he preached about loving one's enemies. Across the street, Alex was clearing a table when he overheard two patrons discussing what had happened. "I thought this place was all about intellectual freedom and questioning dogma," said one, a middle-aged professor type with elbow patches on his jacket. "But that seemed like exactly the kind of rigid thinking we claim to reject." His companion nodded thoughtfully. "I'm an atheist through and through, but refusing service to someone just because they're religious? That's not the answer." Alex carried the dishes to the kitchen, the conversation echoing in his mind. He'd started working at the philosophy table 6 months ago, attracted by its mission of creating community for free thinkers. The pay wasn't great, but he believed in what Diane was building. Now, he wasn't so sure. He remembered watching The Chosen once out of curiosity, and being surprised by its humanity and lack of preachiness. In her office, Diane was researching Jonathan Roumie online, scrolling through interviews and social media posts. She'd expected to find ammunition, hateful comments about atheists, judgmental sermons, the usual religious intolerance she'd experienced throughout her life. Instead, she found thoughtful discussions about faith, videos where he spoke about loving people regardless of their beliefs, and charitable work that never seemed to come with strings attached. One interview particularly caught her attention. Jonathan was discussing playing Jesus and said, "He ate with everyone. He loved everyone. He didn't require people to believe in him before showing them compassion. That's the example I try to follow in my own life." Diane sat back in her chair, an uncomfortable feeling settling in her chest. Had she just turned away someone who, ironically, might have been more aligned with her values of inclusion than she had been herself? Jonathan finished his coffee and checked the time. He needed to head to the church soon for sound check before his talk. As he gathered his things, the bell above the coffee shop door jingled. He looked up to see a young man in the philosophy table's uniform, black shirt, gray apron, approaching his table with an uncertain expression. "Mr. Roumie?" the server said, fidgeting with his apron strings. "I'm Alex. I work at the restaurant across the street." He gestured vaguely behind him. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened. It didn't seem right to me, and, well, I guess I wanted you to know not everyone there feels the same way." Jonathan smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Thank you, Alex. That means a lot. And please don't worry. I wasn't offended. Everyone has the right to their beliefs, including Diane." He tilted his head slightly, studying the younger man's anxious expression. "Are you on your break? Would you like to sit down?" Alex glanced at his watch. "I've got about 10 minutes, he admitted, sliding into the chair across from Jonathan. "I don't know why I came over here, honestly. I'm an atheist myself. But the way you handled that situation," he trailed off, searching for words. "I guess I expected you to be angry or defensive. You aren't what I expected." "People rarely are what we expect when we actually take the time to know them." Jonathan replied, "That's true whether they're atheists, Christians, or anything else. We're all just humans trying to figure life out." He leaned forward slightly, his expression open and engaged. "What brought you to work at the philosophy table?" For the next 8 minutes, Jonathan mostly listened as Alex shared his story. Growing up in a strict religious household, where questions were discouraged, feeling judged for his doubts, finding freedom when he finally admitted he didn't believe. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully, asking occasional questions but never interjecting with counter-arguments or attempts to convert. "I should get back," Alex said finally, standing reluctantly. "But thank you for listening. You're not what I thought a religious person would be like." He hesitated, then added, "Your Jesus would have eaten at our restaurant, wouldn't he? Even knowing it was full of atheists." Jonathan smiled broadly at that. "Especially knowing it was full of atheists. Breaking bread together is where walls start coming down." He shook Alex's hand again. "Thank you for coming over, Alex. It was a pleasure meeting you." As Alex hurried back across the street, Jonathan gathered his things and headed to his car. He had a speaking engagement to prepare for, and he'd put the restaurant incident behind him. But what he didn't know was that his brief conversation with Alex was just the beginning of what would unfold over the next few days. Back at the philosophy table, Alex returned to find Diane waiting for him with a stern expression. "Where did you go during your shift?" she demanded, having noticed his absence. When Alex admitted he'd gone to speak with Jonathan, Diane's face flushed with anger. "You did what? That completely undermines what we stand for here." "Does it?" Alex challenged, surprising himself with his boldness. "I thought we stood for free thinking and questioning dogma. Isn't refusing to even talk to someone because of their beliefs the definition of dogma?" Several nearby staff members pretended to be busy while clearly listening to every word. Diane opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The restaurant was still busy with the dinner crowd, and this wasn't the time or place for this conversation. "We'll discuss this later," she said firmly, turning back toward her office. But the seed of doubt had been planted, not just in Alex's mind but in Diane's as well. That evening, Jonathan spoke to a packed church about his journey of faith and his experience portraying Jesus in The Chosen. He didn't mention what had happened at the philosophy table. Instead, he talked about encountering God's love in unexpected places and seeing Christ in the faces of strangers. He spoke about how playing Jesus had deepened his compassion for those who felt lost or rejected. The most powerful thing about Jesus, he told the rapt audience, wasn't his miracles, it was his willingness to cross boundaries, to love people that society had deemed unlovable, to eat with those that religious people rejected, and he calls us to do the same. The words carried special resonance given what had happened earlier, though only Jonathan knew that. After the event, as Jonathan signed books and took photos with attendees, a middle-aged woman approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Roumie," she said, "I was at the philosophy table today when you were turned away." Jonathan looked up in surprise. "I just wanted you to know that what you did, how you responded, it made me think. I'm not religious myself, but your kindness was convicting. Jonathan thanked her sincerely. What's your name? He asked. When she told him she was Lily, he smiled. Well, Lily, thank you for coming tonight. That means a lot. He didn't push or preach, just accepted her words with genuine gratitude. Lily left the church deep in thought, carrying a signed program and questions she hadn't had in years. The next morning, Jonathan was preparing to leave Portland when his phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged him in a social media post that was gaining traction. Curious, he opened it to find a lengthy post from a user named @PortlandAtheist, describing what had happened at the philosophy table. The post praised Jonathan's gracious response and questioned whether refusing service based on religious belief was consistent with humanist values. The post was going viral, with thousands of shares and comments. Many were expressing outrage on Jonathan's behalf, but he was relieved to see that the conversation wasn't simply dividing along religious lines. Many self-identified atheists were criticizing the restaurant's actions, while some Christians were sharing thoughtful perspectives on private businesses and freedom of association. Jonathan sighed, knowing that this would likely blow up into exactly the kind of controversy he'd hoped to avoid. He crafted a careful response. I appreciate everyone's concern, but please don't use this incident to attack the philosophy table or its owner. They've created a space for a community that often feels marginalized, and that's their right. I hope this can be a moment for mutual understanding rather than further division. His response only fueled more interest in the story. By midday, local news outlets had picked it up, and Jonathan's publicist was fielding calls from national media. The philosophy table's social media accounts were flooded with comments, some supportive, many critical. Diane had stopped answering the phone after the fifth call from a reporter. At the philosophy table, the staff was divided. Some, like Alex, felt uncomfortable with what had happened. Others defended Diane's right to create a space specifically for the atheist community. The lunch rush was slower than usual, with several regular customers noticeably absent. But there were also new faces, people who had come out of curiosity after hearing the story. Diane stayed in her office most of the day, alternating between defending her decision to friends who called and questioning it herself. The restaurant had been her dream. A place where atheists could gather without the constant pressure of religious norms that permeated the rest of society. She'd invested her life savings in creating this space. Now, it felt like it was all unraveling because of one interaction. That afternoon, Alex knocked on Diane's office door with an unexpected request. Some of us want to invite Jonathan back, he said without preamble when she let him in, not to make a statement or for publicity, but because we think this could be an opportunity for real dialogue. The kind of intellectual exchange this place was supposed to be about. Diane stared at him in disbelief. You can't be serious. After all the backlash we're getting? After I've been called every name in the book online? You want to invite him back? Her voice rose with each question, stress evident in every word. Yes, Alex said simply. Because it's the right thing to do. And because I think it could actually help the restaurant, not hurt it. He paused, then added more gently. I did some research on him last night. Did you know he regularly has atheists on his podcast? That he's spoken about respecting people of all beliefs? He's not what you think he is, Diane. Diane sank into her chair, suddenly looking exhausted. The truth was, she had been up most of the night watching interviews with Jonathan Roumie, reading about his charity work, exploring his perspectives on faith and doubt. What she'd found had challenged her preconceptions. I'll think about it, she said finally, which was more than Alex had expected. Later that evening, after the restaurant closed, Diane called a staff meeting. The day had been difficult. Customer numbers down, negative reviews flooding their online profiles, even a few protesters with signs about religious discrimination outside during the dinner hour. Everyone looked tired and worried about their jobs. I made a mistake yesterday, Diane said after everyone had gathered, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the admission. I acted out of old wounds and assumptions rather than the principles of free inquiry and respect for human dignity that this restaurant was founded on. A murmur went through the assembled staff. This was not what most had expected to hear. The philosophy table was created to be a place where ideas could be openly discussed, where people could question traditional thinking without judgment. In turning Jonathan Roumie away based solely on his religious identity, I contradicted those very values. Diane pushed her glasses up on her nose, a nervous habit when she felt vulnerable. I've decided to invite him back, if he's willing to come. The staff had mixed reactions. Some, like Alex, nodded in approval. Others looked skeptical or concerned. But what about our mission of creating a safe space for atheists? Asked Zoe, the hostess who had first recognized Jonathan. Doesn't that matter anymore? It absolutely matters, Diane assured her. But I've been thinking about what safe space really means. Is it a bubble where we never encounter different viewpoints? Or is it a place where we can engage with those differences thoughtfully, without fear of being condemned for our own beliefs? I think it's the latter. And from everything I've learned about Jonathan Roumie in the past 24 hours, he seems like exactly the kind of person who could engage in that spirit. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Eventually, they reached a consensus. They would invite Jonathan back, not for a public reconciliation event that might seem like a publicity stunt, but for a genuine dialogue. They would offer to host a small dinner after hours. Diane, several staff members, and a few regular customers who represented the restaurant's community, breaking bread with Jonathan and having an honest conversation about faith, doubt, and how people with fundamental differences could still treat each other with dignity. The question was, would he accept? After all, Jonathan was only in Portland for another day, and after the way he'd been treated, no one would blame him for declining. Alex volunteered to reach out since he'd already spoken with Jonathan briefly. Diane agreed, though she promised to write a personal apology as well. Jonathan was in his hotel room, packing for his early flight the next morning, when he received Alex's call. The young server sounded nervous as he explained Diane's change of heart and the invitation for dinner that evening. Jonathan listened without interrupting, a smile gradually spreading across his face. "I'd be honored to come," Jonathan said when Alex finished. "What time should I arrive?" They arranged for him to come at 9 p.m. after the restaurant had closed to the public. Before hanging up, Jonathan added, "Please thank Diane for reconsidering. It takes courage to change one's mind, especially publicly." At 8:55 that evening, Jonathan parked outside the philosophy table. The closed sign was illuminated, but he could see movement inside. He took a moment to pray before getting out of his car, asking for wisdom and the ability to truly listen to those he was about to meet. Then he walked to the door and knocked gently. Diane herself opened the door, looking both professional and slightly apprehensive in a simple black dress with a geometric pendant, the atheist atom symbol. Jonathan recognized. "Mr. Roumie," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming. I want to personally apologize for yesterday." Jonathan shook her hand warmly. "Please call me Jonathan, and there's no need for apologies. I understand the impulse to protect your community." He glanced past her to where several people waited at a large table arranged in the center of the restaurant. "I'm just grateful for the opportunity to get to know you all better." Inside, Diane had arranged a beautiful dinner. In addition to Alex and Zoe, there were 4 regular customers who had been interested in the dialogue. Lily, who had attended Jonathan's church talk. Marcus, a philosophy professor at Portland State University. Elena, a science writer who helped organize local atheist events. And Tomas, a former evangelical pastor who had left the faith and found community at the philosophy table. "I thought we could start with introductions," Diane suggested after everyone was seated. The table was set with care. Candles, a simple but elegant pasta dinner, wine for those who wanted it. Perhaps each of us could share a bit about our background and why we're here tonight. What followed was one of the most extraordinary evenings any of them had experienced. Each person shared their story, not just what they believed or didn't believe, but why. Marcus spoke of finding meaning in a universe without divine purpose. Alina described her love of science and the wonder she felt contemplating the cosmos without a creator. Tomas shared the pain of losing his faith and the freedom he'd found afterward. When it was Jonathan's turn, he spoke candidly about his own journey, periods of doubt, his rediscovery of faith as an adult, and how playing Jesus had deepened his understanding of what it meant to love unconditionally. The Jesus I've come to know through studying for this role doesn't call us to judge or condemn, he explained. He calls us to love sacrificially, especially those who see the world differently than we do. The conversation flowed naturally from personal stories to deeper questions. They discussed the meaning of morality with and without God, the historical Jesus versus the religious figure, the role of community in both religious and secular contexts. There were moments of tension and disagreement, but also surprising points of connection and understanding. I've always assumed Christians wanted to convert me, Belina admitted at one point, that any kindness was just a means to that end. She looked directly at Jonathan. Is that what you're doing now, being kind so we'll become Christians? Jonathan considered the question carefully. I believe the truth of Christ stands on its own, he said finally. My job isn't to convert anyone, that's between you and God, if he exists. My job is simply to love you as a fellow human being made in God's image, whether you recognize that or not. If my kindness makes you curious about the source of that love, wonderful. But the kindness isn't conditional on your response. Diane watched the exchange with growing interest. There was something authentic about Jonathan that had caught her off guard. He didn't evade difficult questions or resort to platitudes. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding their perspectives, not just waiting for his turn to speak. It was so different from her previous experiences with religious people. As the evening progressed, the initial awkwardness dissolved into something that felt remarkably like friendship. They laughed together about the absurdity of the culture wars, found common ground in their desire for a more compassionate society, and respectfully explored their differences without attempting to convert or convince. You know, Marcus said thoughtfully, swirling the last of his wine, Socrates believed that wisdom begins in dialogue, in the respectful exchange of ideas between people who disagree. This is precisely the kind of conversation the philosophy table was created to foster. It just took this unusual circumstance to remind us of that. Diane nodded, looking both pleased and contemplative. I created this place because I was tired of feeling like an outsider in a predominantly Christian culture. I wanted a space where atheists could feel normal, accepted. She looked around the table. But in trying to create that safe space, I nearly fell into the same exclusionary thinking I've criticized in others. It's a natural human tendency, Jonathan offered. We all seek tribes where we belong. The challenge is maintaining that sense of belonging without demonizing those outside our tribe. He smiled. Jesus was constantly crossing tribal boundaries, eating with people his religious community considered unclean or unworthy. That's the example I try to follow, though I fall short more often than I'd like to admit. By the time they finished their tiramisu, Diane's grandmother's recipe, it was nearly midnight. The conversation had ranged from philosophy to personal struggles, from big existential questions to small daily practices that gave their lives meaning. No one had changed their fundamental worldview, but each person felt enriched by the exchange. I should let you all get home, Jonathan said eventually, aware of the late hour. I have an early flight tomorrow. But I want to thank each of you for this evening. It's been one of the most meaningful conversations I've had in a long time. He meant it sincerely. There was something special about breaking bread with people across such a significant ideological divide. As they gathered their things, Diane approached Jonathan privately. I've been thinking, she said, her voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. This kind of dialogue, it's valuable. Not just for us but potentially for others too. She hesitated, then continued. Would you consider coming back sometime? Perhaps for a public conversation about faith and doubt? We could host it here. Jonathan's eyebrows rose in surprise. You'd want to do that? Even with your regular customers? He was genuinely curious, not challenging her sincerity. Diane nodded firmly. I think it's exactly what this place should be about. Not an echo chamber, but a forum for thoughtful exchange across differences. She smiled wryly. Besides, after how I treated you initially, it seems like the right thing to do. A chance to model the kind of intellectual integrity we claim to value. I'd be honored, Jonathan said, meaning it. My schedule is pretty full with filming, but I come to Portland several times a year. Let's make it happen." They exchanged contact information, both recognizing that something significant had shifted, not just between them personally, but in the possibility they'd glimpsed for bridging seemingly unbridgeable divides. As Jonathan prepared to leave, Alex approached him one last time. "Thank you," the young server said quietly. "Not just for coming tonight, but for how you responded yesterday. It made me think about what I really believe about treating people with dignity, regardless of their beliefs." Jonathan clasped his shoulder warmly. "Thank you for having the courage to cross the street and start a conversation. That's where healing begins." He glanced around at the others, who were saying their goodbyes. "Keep talking with each other, okay? Keep asking the hard questions, but always with kindness." When Jonathan finally left the philosophy table that night, he felt a deep sense of peace. What had begun as rejection had transformed into connection. He hadn't compromised his faith or watered down his convictions, but he had demonstrated the love of Christ in a way that transcended words. As he drove back to his hotel, he prayed for each person he'd met, asking not for their conversion, but for their well-being and continued searching. 3 months later, the philosophy table hosted its first public dialogue event, Faith and Doubt, a conversation across differences. Jonathan Roumie returned to Portland to join Diane Mercer, Marcus the philosophy professor, and Elena the science writer for a moderated discussion about finding meaning in a complex world. The event sold out within hours of being announced. The restaurant was packed that evening, with additional chairs brought in to accommodate the crowd. People from all belief systems sat side by side, atheists next to evangelicals, agnostics beside Catholics. There was an energy in the room, a sense of anticipation and openness that transcended the usual tribal boundaries. Jonathan and Diane shared the story of their initial encounter and how it had led to this unlikely partnership. The audience laughed at the awkwardness of that first meeting and fell silent during the more profound reflections on what had changed for each of them through the experience. "I learned that I had become what I claimed to oppose," Diane admitted honestly. "I was judging someone based on a label, rather than taking the time to know them as a person. In trying to create a space free from religious judgment, I had become judgmental myself." The vulnerability in her voice resonated with many in the audience who recognized similar contradictions in themselves. "And I was reminded of something essential about my faith," Jonathan added. "Jesus didn't call us to create bubbles where everyone believes as we do. He called us to love radically, especially across the lines that usually divide us. Sometimes that means being willing to sit at tables where we might be uncomfortable, but where real connection can happen." His words resonated with the Christians in the audience, many of whom had never considered their faith in quite this light. The dialogue that followed was honest, respectful, and surprisingly vulnerable. Marcus spoke eloquently about finding meaning in a universe he believed had no inherent purpose. Elena shared how scientific discovery filled her with the same awe that many religious people described as worship. Jonathan talked about how his faith had been strengthened, not weakened, by wrestling with doubt. Throughout the evening, there were moments of tension when fundamental worldviews collided, but these were navigated with mutual respect and genuine curiosity. The audience witnessed something rare in today's polarized culture: people who profoundly disagreed, finding common humanity without compromising their convictions. In the weeks that followed, the philosophy table saw a transformation. Rather than losing its identity as an atheist gathering place, it expanded into something more complex and vibrant. Regular discussion groups formed, bringing together people of various beliefs who wanted to continue the kind of dialogue they'd witnessed at the event. Diane, once so protective of the secular space she'd created, found herself hosting regular Believers and Doubters dinner events, where people from different worldviews could share a meal and conversation. These weren't debates designed to declare winners and losers, but genuine exchanges aimed at understanding. Alex, who had first crossed the street to apologize to Jonathan, became the coordinator for these dialogue events. His own journey had evolved too, not toward religion but toward a more nuanced understanding of faith and the people who held it. He and Jonathan stayed in touch, exchanging occasional texts about life, philosophy, and the power of unexpected friendships. For Jonathan, the experience reinforced what he had learned through playing Jesus in The Chosen: that love transcends tribal boundaries, that genuine connection happens when we're willing to be present with those who see the world differently, and that sometimes rejection can open doors to the most meaningful encounters. 6 months after the first dialogue event, the philosophy table had become known throughout Portland as a place where the most difficult conversations could happen with civility and depth. Business had increased, with people coming not just for the food, but for the unique atmosphere of intellectual engagement across differences. During a break in filming The Chosen, Jonathan returned to Portland for another event at the philosophy table. This time, the line stretched around the block, with people of all beliefs eager to witness and participate in the dialogue. As Jonathan entered, Diane greeted him with a warm hug, a gesture that would have been unimaginable during their first encounter. "We've started something important here," she told him as they prepared for the evening's conversation. "People are hungry for this, not just food, but real dialogue that doesn't devolve into shouting or silence." She adjusted her glasses, a familiar gesture Jonathan now recognized as a sign she was sharing something meaningful. "I still don't believe in your God, but I believe in what we're doing here." Jonathan smiled, deeply moved by how far they had come. "That's more than enough for now," he replied sincerely. "The rest is in God's hands, not mine." Before taking the stage, he looked around at the diverse crowd gathering in the restaurant: atheists, Christians, spiritual seekers, skeptics, all united by a desire to understand rather than simply convert or convince. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of table Jesus would have loved. The dialogue that night focused on finding common ground in addressing community needs: homelessness, education, caring for the elderly. Despite their different motivations, some driven by religious conviction, others by humanist values, they discovered significant overlap in their vision for a compassionate society. "It turns out," Marcus observed during a particularly insightful exchange, "that when we focus on the good we can do, rather than on converting each other to our worldview, remarkable collaboration becomes possible." There were nods around the table, as people who would once have seen each other as ideological enemies recognized their shared humanity. After the event, a young woman approached Jonathan, visibly nervous. "I've been an atheist all my life," she told him. "And to be honest, I've avoided Christians because I assumed they would judge me. But watching you these past months, how you responded to being turned away, how you engage with people like Diane without trying to convert them, it's made me curious about your faith." She paused, then added, "I'm not saying I believe, but for the first time, I'm willing to ask questions." Jonathan responded with genuine warmth but no pressure. "Questions are the beginning of any authentic journey," he said. "Faith isn't about certainty, it's about trust in the midst of questions. If you'd like to explore those questions, I'd be happy to point you toward resources, or you could join one of the discussion groups here. Either way, your journey is your own, and it's worthy of respect." The woman thanked him and left with a thoughtful expression. Jonathan didn't know if she would ever embrace faith, but he trusted that the seeds of respectful dialogue had been planted. And that, he believed, was what his role as a follower of Christ was truly about: not forcing conversion, but creating spaces where genuine encounter could happen. 1 year after Jonathan was turned away from the philosophy table, a small bronze plaque was installed near the entrance. It read, "At this table, strangers become friends, questions are honored, and differences are bridged with respect and curiosity." It was Diane's idea, a permanent reminder of what had been learned through one moment of rejection, transformed by grace. The story of what happened at the philosophy table began to spread beyond Portland. A documentary filmmaker approached Diane and Jonathan about capturing their unlikely friendship and the community that had formed around their dialogue events. Media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a rare example of bridging America's deep cultural divides. On the set of The Chosen, Jonathan shared the experience with his castmates and with Dallas Jenkins, the show's creator. "It's exactly what we're trying to portray about Jesus," Dallas observed. how he crossed boundaries, ate with everyone, and demonstrated love rather than just talking about it. The story influenced how certain scenes were filmed, bringing additional depth to the portrayal of Jesus' interactions with those outside his religious tradition. Diane, once known primarily as the atheist restaurant owner who turned away Jonathan Roumie, was now increasingly recognized for her commitment to meaningful dialogue. She was invited to speak at conferences on civil discourse, and wrote thoughtful pieces about finding common ground without compromising one's core values. "What I've learned," she told a packed auditorium at Portland State University, "is that creating truly safe spaces isn't about excluding those who disagree with us. It's about establishing norms of respect and curiosity that allow authentic exchange to happen." Students who had been caught in their own campus culture wars listened intently, hungry for models of engagement that moved beyond polarization. Alex, whose simple decision to cross the street and apologize had catalyzed so much of what followed, found his own life transformed by the experience. He had originally taken the job at the philosophy table as just a way to pay bills while figuring out his future. Now he was pursuing a degree in conflict resolution, inspired by witnessing how genuine dialogue could heal seemingly unbridgeable divides. "I used to think that rejecting religion meant rejecting religious people," he told Jonathan during one of his return visits to Portland. "But you showed me that it's possible to stay true to your pet convictions while still building meaningful relationships across differences. That's changed everything for me." As the philosophy table's reputation grew, skeptics emerged. Some atheists criticized Diane for selling out to religious influence. Some Christians questioned Jonathan's willingness to engage with atheists without explicitly evangelizing. Both faced the challenge of explaining that their approach wasn't about compromising their beliefs, but about embodying them more fully. "Jesus didn't call us to isolation but to incarnation," Jonathan explained when asked about his involvement with a predominantly atheist establishment. "He entered fully into human experience and loved people as they were, not as he wished them to be. That's the model I'm trying to follow, however imperfectly." Diane faced similar questions from her atheist colleagues. "I haven't abandoned skeptical inquiry," she insisted. "I've deepened it." True skepticism means being willing to question our own assumptions, not just other people's beliefs. That includes examining whether our approach to religious differences has been consistent with our humanist values. Their answers didn't satisfy everyone, but they resonated with many who were tired of the cultural stalemate, the endless cycle of outrage, counter-outrage, and deepening division that characterized so much of public discourse. The philosophy table offered an alternative vision of engagement across profound differences. 2 years after that initial rejection, Jonathan was in Portland filming a small scene for The Chosen. During a break, he stopped by the philosophy table for lunch. No advance notice, no special event, just a quiet meal during a busy workday. Diane spotted him first and came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Jonathan, why didn't you tell me you were coming?" she exclaimed, giving him a warm hug. The restaurant was full of lunchtime customers, many of whom recognized the actor and watched with interest as the once rejecting owner greeted him like an old friend. "Spur-of-the-moment decision," Jonathan explained with a smile. "We're filming just a few blocks away, thought I'd stop in for the soup of the day. Alex texted me, 'It's your Hungarian mushroom today.'" He glanced around the restaurant, noting the diverse clientele and the animated conversations happening at several tables. "The place looks great. Busy too." "Best lunch crowd we've had in months," Diane confirmed, leading him to a small table by the window, the same window he'd looked through from across the street after being turned away. "The dialogue events have actually been good for business. People come for the conversations and discover the food is pretty great too." There was justifiable pride in her voice. She had created something unique and valuable. As Jonathan ate his soup and homemade bread, he watched the life of the restaurant unfold around him. At one table, a group that appeared to be a Bible study was engaged in animated discussion. At another, members of a local humanist organization were planning a community service project. The boundaries between these groups, once so rigid, had become permeable through the culture Diane had helped create. After lunch, before heading back to the set, Jonathan paused by the bronze plaque near the entrance, reading the words that commemorated their journey. At this table, strangers become friends, questions are honored, and differences are bridged with respect and curiosity. Diane joined him, standing quietly at his side. "Did you ever imagine this is where we'd end up?" she asked, gesturing around at what the philosophy table had become. Not just a restaurant, but a genuine community of diverse beliefs, united by mutual respect in common humanity. Jonathan shook his head, smiling. "Not specifically this, no, but I've learned to trust that when we respond to rejection with grace rather than anger, God often has bigger plans than we can see in the moment." He turned to face her. "You know, I'm grateful you turned me away that day." As strange as that sounds, Diane's eyebrows rose in surprise. Grateful? Really? It was still difficult for her to think about that initial interaction without embarrassment, despite all the good that had come from it. "Absolutely," Jonathan confirmed. "If you'd served me dinner that night, we would have had a pleasant meal, maybe a brief conversation, and that would have been it. Instead, we've been part of building something meaningful, something that's touching lives far beyond our own." He gestured toward the diverse groups of people eating and talking throughout the restaurant. "This wouldn't exist if everything had gone smoothly." Diane considered his words thoughtfully. "I guess sometimes the hard moments, the mistakes, the rejections, those can open doors we never would have found otherwise." It was a perspective she had come to appreciate through their friendship, this ability to find meaning and possibility even in difficult circumstances. "Exactly," Jonathan agreed. "It's like what I've learned playing Jesus. Some of the most beautiful reconciliations come from the most painful separations. It's not that God wants the pain, but He can work through it if we're willing." He checked his watch reluctantly. "I should get back to set. Dallas will be wondering where I disappeared to." As they said goodbye, several customers approached to express appreciation for the dialogue events and the community that had formed around the philosophy table. Jonathan listened attentively to each person, genuinely interested in their stories and perspectives. There was no hint of celebrity impatience, just present and engaged attention, something he had cultivated through his spiritual practices and his work portraying Jesus. Later that evening, after filming wrapped, Jonathan called Dallas to share what he had experienced at the philosophy table. "It's extraordinary," he explained. "This place that once turned me away because of my faith has become a model for the kind of engagement Jesus demonstrated, breaking bread with everyone, valuing questions as much as answers, seeing the image of God in each person regardless of their beliefs." Dallas listened thoughtfully. "You know," he said when Jonathan finished, "we're always looking for ways to help people experience the authentic Jesus beyond just watching the show. This kind of dialogue model, it's something we might want to explore more intentionally. Not debates or apologetics, but genuine conversation over meals, like Jesus did." The seed of a new initiative was planted in that conversation, what would eventually become Tables of Chosen, small gathering groups focused on creating spaces for diverse perspectives to engage around themes from the show. Jonathan would become one of its most enthusiastic advocates, drawing on his experience with the philosophy table as a model. 3 years after the initial incident, the philosophy table published a small book titled Across the Table: How an Atheist Restaurant Owner and a Christian Actor Found Common Ground. Co-authored by Diane and Jonathan, it told the story of their unlikely friendship and the principles they had discovered for meaningful dialogue across deep differences. In the book's introduction, they wrote, "We come from worldviews that are often portrayed as irreconcilably opposed. One of us sees a universe designed by a loving creator. The other sees a cosmos of beautiful but unplanned complexity. We have not changed each other's minds about these fundamental perspectives, but we have discovered something perhaps more important, that human connection transcends these differences when approached with genuine curiosity and respect." The book wasn't a bestseller, but it found a devoted audience among those working in community building, conflict resolution, and interfaith dialogue. College professors assigned it in courses on civil discourse, Religious leaders and secular humanist groups alike found value in its practical wisdom about engaging across differences without compromising core values. When asked in interviews what made their friendship possible despite such fundamental differences, Diane and Jonathan gave complimentary answers. "Jonathan never treated me like a project to be converted," Diane would explain. "He engaged with me as a full human being worthy of respect, regardless of whether I ever came to share his beliefs." Jonathan, in turn, would point to Diane's willingness to reconsider her initial judgment. She demonstrated one of the virtues both Christians and humanists value: humility, he would say. "The willingness to admit when we've been wrong and to change course accordingly. That's rare courage in today's culture, and it made everything else possible." The philosophy table continued to evolve, eventually opening a second location in Seattle with the same commitment to fostering meaningful dialogue across differences. The restaurants became known as places where people could bring their whole selves, beliefs, doubts, questions, and all, and find respectful engagement rather than judgment or pressure. For Jonathan, the experience reinforced what he tried to bring to his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen: an authentic embodiment of love that crossed boundaries without agenda or conditions. In interviews about the show, he often referenced his friendship with Diane as an example of finding common ground without compromising truth. "One of the things I've learned from playing Jesus," he explained on a popular podcast, "is that he was never afraid of genuine relationship with people who saw the world differently. He didn't water down his message, but he also didn't make relationship conditional on agreement. That's the balance I'm always trying to find in my own life." At the philosophy table's 5th anniversary celebration, a diverse crowd gathered to honor what the restaurant had come to represent in Portland and beyond. Representatives from various faith traditions sat alongside secular humanists, united not by shared beliefs, but by shared values: curiosity, respect, and a commitment to finding common humanity across differences. Jonathan was invited as a special guest, his schedule carefully arranged around filming commitments to allow him to attend. When he entered, he received a standing ovation, not because of his celebrity, but because of what he had helped create through his response to rejection 5 years earlier. "When I walked into this restaurant that first day," he told the gathered crowd, "I had no idea what would unfold. I was just hungry and looking for a good meal." Laughter rippled through the audience. "I certainly never imagined that being turned away would lead to one of the most meaningful friendships and projects of my life." Jonathan glanced at Diane, who sat nearby listening with a smile. "I've often been asked if I forgive Diane for that initial rejection. The truth is, there's nothing to forgive." Her honesty that day, uncomfortable as it was in the moment, created an opportunity for authentic engagement that politeness might have prevented. Sometimes the most difficult moments are doorways to the most beautiful possibilities. Diane rose to stand beside him, her own journey evident in her relaxed posture and confident smile, so different from the defensive, anxious woman who had crossed her arms and refused service to a Christian actor 5 years before. "What Jonathan taught me," she said, addressing the crowd, "is that real tolerance isn't about pretending our differences don't matter. It's about engaging those differences with respect and curiosity, rather than fear and judgment." Together, they unveiled a new installation at the restaurant, a simple wooden table near the entrance with an inscription carved along its edge: "At this table, there are no strangers." It would serve as a designated community table, where solo diners could sit together regardless of background or belief, with the understanding that meaningful conversation was welcome. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and celebrated, Alex, now completing graduate studies in conflict resolution, approached Jonathan with news. "We're taking the model to other cities," he explained excitedly. "Not just restaurants, but coffee shops, community centers, even some houses of worship, places where people with fundamental disagreements can practice the art of dialogue without demonization." Jonathan listened with genuine interest as Alex outlined the initiative, which had grown from the seed planted at the philosophy table. "What's your role in all this?" he asked, genuinely curious about the young man's journey from server to dialogue facilitator. "I'm helping train facilitators," Alex explained. Teaching the principles we've developed here. How to create safe spaces for uncomfortable conversations, how to honor difference without demanding agreement, how to find common humanity across deep divides. His eyes shone with purpose and passion. 5 years ago, I was just a confused kid trying to figure out my place in the world. Now I feel like I'm part of something important. As the evening wound down, Jonathan found a quiet moment with Diane. They stood by the window where he had once looked in from across the street, now looking out together at the city they had both come to love. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you just served me dinner that first night?" he asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Diane laughed softly. "All the time. We'd probably have had a pleasant but forgettable meal. You'd have left a nice tip. I'd have gone back to my comfortable assumptions about religious people. And none of—" She gestured around them at the vibrant community gathered in the restaurant. "None of this would exist." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "It reminds me of something I've learned through studying Jesus' life for the chosen. So often, the moments that seem like rejection or failure are actually the beginning of something beautiful. The stone the builders rejected becomes the cornerstone." Diane smiled at the biblical reference, no longer uncomfortable with such language, even if she didn't share the belief behind it. "In my humanist terms, I'd say that sometimes our mistakes, honestly confronted, can lead to our greatest growth." She paused, looking at the diverse gathering of people whose lives had been touched by what had grown from that initial conflict. "I'm grateful for that mistake, and for your grace in response to it." As Jonathan prepared to leave, several guests approached to express their appreciation. Not just for his acting work, but for the model of engagement he had helped create. A young Christian woman thanked him for demonstrating how to remain firm in faith while extending genuine friendship across differences. An atheist professor expressed gratitude for showing that meaningful dialogue didn't require abandoning one's convictions. What struck Jonathan most was how the impact extended far beyond his original interaction with Diane. The simple choice to respond to rejection with kindness, rather than outrage, had created ripples that continued to spread in ways he could never have anticipated. It was, he reflected, a living example of how love multiplies when freely given, without expectation of return. On the flight back to the set of The Chosen, Jonathan jotted notes for a devotional he'd been asked to write on Jesus' command to love enemies and pray for persecutors. The experience with the philosophy table had given him insights that went beyond theological abstraction to lived reality, the transformative power of responding to rejection with grace, the unexpected doors that open when we refuse to answer hostility with hostility. "Perhaps the most radical act of faith," he wrote, "isn't defending doctrine or winning arguments, but choosing to see the image of God in those who reject us, and responding with love rather than retaliation. This doesn't mean abandoning truth, but embodying it in a way that creates possibilities for genuine encounter." Meanwhile, back in Portland, Diane was closing up the philosophy table after the celebration. As she turned out lights and checked that everything was ready for the morning crew, she found herself reflecting on the journey of the past 5 years. From a defensive attempt to create an atheist-safe space, the restaurant had evolved into something far more nuanced and vibrant, a genuine community where differences were neither ignored nor weaponized, but engaged with respect and curiosity. She paused by the new community table, running her fingers along the carved inscription, "At this table, there are no strangers." It represented everything she had learned through her unlikely friendship with Jonathan, that meaningful connection across differences was not only possible, but deeply enriching, that the boundaries between us and them were more permeable than she had once believed. The next morning, a young woman entered the philosophy table for breakfast. She was new to Portland, still finding her way in the city. She had heard about the restaurant's unique atmosphere and decided to check it out. As she hesitated near the entrance, unsure where to sit alone, Diane approached with a warm smile. "Would you like to sit at our community table?" she offered, gesturing to the wooden table with its carved inscription. "It's a place where solo diners can share a table and conversation, if they wish." The young woman nodded gratefully, and Diane led her to the table where two others already sat, an elderly man reading a Bible, and a middle-aged woman with a book on Buddhist meditation. As Diane walked away, she overheard the beginning of their conversation, tentative at first, then warming, as they discovered shared interests despite different worldviews. It was happening again, this alchemy of turning strangers into friends through the simple act of breaking bread together across differences. This was the legacy of that moment 5 years ago when Jonathan Roumie had been turned away, but had responded with grace rather than anger. Thousands of miles away, on the set of The Chosen, Jonathan was filming a scene where Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, scandalizing the religious authorities of his day. Between takes, he reflected on how his experience with the philosophy table had deepened his understanding of these moments in Jesus' ministry. The radical inclusion, the willingness to cross boundaries, the priority of relationship over reputation. "What made you decide to eat with these people?" asked the actor playing a skeptical Pharisee, reading his line from the script. The question resonated beyond the scene they were filming, touching on Jonathan's own journey of engagement across differences. "Because love is greater than fear," Jonathan responded as Jesus, the words flowing from a place of lived experience as much as artistic interpretation. "Because at my Father's table there are no strangers, only children who haven't yet recognized their belonging." It wasn't in the script exactly that way, but Dallas nodded approvingly from behind the camera, recognizing the authentic truth in the improvised line. That evening, Jonathan received a text from Diane, with a photo of the community table full of diverse patrons engaged in animated conversation. "Your legacy," she had written simply. Jonathan smiled, knowing that it was really their legacy. What had grown from rejection transformed by grace, from the courage to reach across differences with respect rather than fear. What began as a moment of rejection in a Portland restaurant had become something neither Jonathan nor Diane could have imagined. A model for engaging across the deepest divides of belief and worldview. A community that valued both conviction and connection, and most importantly, a living demonstration that love can indeed transcend the boundaries that so often separate us from one another. In his wallet, Jonathan carried a small card with words that had guided him through that initial encounter, and many that followed. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. Whether attributed to Augustine or Wesley, the wisdom had proven true in his experience, that treating others with dignity, even in disagreement, created possibilities that self-righteous anger never could. In Diane's office at the philosophy table hung a simple framed quote from secular humanist philosopher John Rawls. "The duty of civility involves a willingness to listen to others, and a fair-mindedness in deciding when accommodations to their views should be made." It reminded her daily of the lesson she had learned through her friendship with Jonathan. That true tolerance required engagement rather than avoidance, respect rather than indifference. Years later, when asked about the most significant impact of his role in The Chosen, Jonathan would often mention not just the viewers who found faith through the show, but also the unlikely friendships that had formed through his attempts to embody Jesus' boundary-crossing love off-screen. The philosophy table stood as the most profound example, a living testimony to what could happen when rejection was met with grace, rather than retaliation. And when the philosophy table eventually expanded to locations in cities across America, each restaurant maintained the tradition of the community table inscribed with the words, "At this table, there are no strangers." It was a physical embodiment of the principle that had emerged from that pivotal encounter, that genuine dialogue across deep differences isn't just possible but essential, that common humanity can be found without compromising conviction, and that sometimes the most beautiful communities grow from moments of rejection transformed by unexpected grace. In a world increasingly divided by tribal identities and hardened positions, Jonathan Roumie and Diane Mercer offered an alternative vision, not of watered-down beliefs or superficial agreement, but of respectful engagement across real differences, of seeing the full humanity in those with whom we profoundly disagree. It was a vision that began with a simple choice: when faced with rejection, to respond not with the expected outrage, but with the unexpected grace that opens doors to transformation. And in that choice lay an invitation that continues to echo through lives touched by their story. To see rejection not as the end of the road, but as the beginning of a journey toward deeper understanding, unexpected friendship, and the discovery of common ground in the most unlikely of places. Have you ever witnessed how a moment of rejection, when met with grace instead of anger, opened doors to unexpected connection? This story reminds us that our response to difficult moments often determines what grows from them. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe in the power of kindness to bridge our deepest divides.